course, I use Mac, so it always causes a problem. So I don't feel like I have to say anything now. Marianne's done that talk, because it's pretty much everything on me. So I'll try really hard not to be super repetitive. So thanks for having me here. It's sort of odd in a way for me to be here, partially because I feel like the context of what we're exposed to in Vancouver is so much worse than in Europe, in spite of a lot of heroic leaders that we have in Vancouver, both in health and in politics and in the city and in our community. I think the baseline conditions that we're struggling with in Vancouver are way worse than in Europe in general, I would argue, in terms of our homelessness rates, our safety net, and also our drug policy. So it seems odd from that perspective for me to be making a presentation from North America about a success story from Vancouver. But the reason I am here is because it is just a tiny success story, and yet because of that we've had to launch an almighty battle with our federal government. So I'm really here mostly to get your support. So Vancouver, as that slide said, one of the poorest communities in Canada. It's right in the middle of a rapidly gentrifying city. About 17,000 low-income residents, approximately 5,000 injection drug users. In order to fight for the existence of InSite, there was a sort of an already acceptance within our culture of treatment, prevention, and enforcement, but because we were surrounded by what I would call the human fallout of a failed strategy, we had to think differently. It wasn't political, it was humanitarian. But in order to appeal to people who accepted status quo as being helpful, there needed to be a solution that for them wasn't threatening. And so for this reason, the 4 pillars was the way to go. It made harm reduction the 4th piece of a puzzle. It meant no longer isolating needlessly people who were afraid to throw things away that they knew and felt comfortable with. To some extent, the beauty of focusing on just this one piece of the puzzle was that the other pieces didn't have to be specified. So that left treatment nebulous, it left prevention and enforcement also nebulous to some extent. They continue to take on a lot of different meaning to different people, which makes, like I said, the approach less threatening to people who are scared by the concept of harm reduction. For instance, one of the first things that we did as a city was to bring over from Frankfurt the drug policy coordinator, who had also talked about 4 pillars approach in Frankfurt, taking the elements treatment, enforcement, harm reduction, and prevention. And Vancouver's continued to contextualize InSite this way, hopefully reducing some fear and forming more alliances than we would have if we'd isolated just fighting for harm reduction. No one's ever disagreed that prevention is essential, but there's often been disagreement on how best to achieve it. So the support from the prevention community initially was really important to get. In order to open InSite, we had to listen to their perspective, and through sharing our experiences collectively, brought leaders in prevention alongside. What I can say is that when I began working in the neighborhood, the group that we were with had predominantly experienced horrific childhood trauma. For instance, Mary, who was one of our residents, had, as a child, spent many hours locked in her room where she was hurt. She's an Aboriginal woman who was abused as a child. She was emaciated, sexually abused, and had a giant scar across her own throat where she had cut it herself by the age of 13. And by the age of 15, she was addicted to pills and heroin, and by 16, cocaine. To feed her habit, she worked in the sex trade, and she was raped. And like many others, she felt that she deserved what she got, and that it was always her fault. So for people like Mary, existing prevention strategies had obviously failed. There's a lot of problems with enforcement, as far as I'm concerned, but for us in Vancouver, we had to have a letter of support from the police in order to obtain a federal exemption from the criminal code, the exemption that was required for us to operate InSite. Police unions may well be vehemently opposed. However, having the few great police officers as leaders who understand that there is a futility on the war on drugs, who can speak to it, has made a tremendous difference. And in the early days of the campaign, before there were any local leaders, we brought the deputy chief of Frankfurt over for this reason, as well as some other union members also came and spoke in Vancouver. These were persuasive influences in our city and also in the media, because it was very shocking from local Vancouverites' perspectives to hear police talk about something as radical as an injection site and to support it. And what that meant on the ground in real people's lives, like Mary's, police were ever present as part of her life. She never saw herself as a criminal, but just as somebody who deserved absolutely nothing. So her interaction with law enforcement merely confirmed that. So for her and so many others that I've met, enforcement touches their lives but has not come close to dealing with the complex reality of who they are as human beings or what it is that they really need. And I would argue, nor should it. It was equally important to bring along treatment and treatment advocates, although this can be a struggle because, like me, when I first began doing this work, I thought it should be just simple to get people into treatment as long as it was within people's reach. However, I know it's not simple and it's not true, and it's not the case. But treatment fails people every day, people like Mary and hundreds of like her in our community who've tried many times. And in the end, methadone was the one successful treatment intervention in Mary's life. The staff and the team at InSite have great relationships now with the treatment community because they make constant referrals. And now that we're operating a detox and transitional treatment housing program upstairs for people who use the site, this relationship's been strengthened further. But this does not replace the need for there to be a broader spectrum of options for people to engage with in terms of treatment. To win the battle around the injection site, it was equally important to emphasize that no money was being spent on harm reduction in Vancouver at the time. In fact, when InSite opened, the federal government was spending $1.5 million federally on the whole country on harm reduction programs, which is absolutely nothing. So it was important for us to point that out, because there was that dialogue around you taking away from harm reduction, from treatment money somehow. And we still get thrown that all the time. It's like sucking up the resources that should be going to treatment. It's a common perception. But whether, from our perspective, it was in individual conversations, in meetings, or in the media, the argument to help people understand harm reduction was about the human being was the only way we could actually put this agenda on the table and keep it there. So constantly humanizing the face of Mary and people like her, helping the wider community understand who the individual is that uses drugs, helping them have a reason to see that for folks constantly hurting themselves and putting themselves at risk and putting the wider community at risk, people who might in fact be their own family member, their own friend, and that we collectively require a more compassionate approach. For us, harm reduction begins by seeing the person, their life, their pain, their ability, their fear, and starts at that place and says, I see where you are today, and that's where we'll begin. Mary couldn't get counseling during her entire life because she was actively addicted and not apparently ready. But in spite of repeated suicidal thoughts and feelings, and in spite of various abusive relationships, she still developed HIV due to years of needle sharing. Harm reduction says that as a day-to-day reality, this just isn't good enough. And in the end, the lack of funding to harm reduction programs failed her and fails hundreds like her every day across our country. Nothing like InSite was available for Mary when she was alive. And while InSite is a small, tiny intervention, it's essential in what it represents for our country around our attitude and our approach towards ending drugs. When I began running the Portland Hotel back in 1991, I was a nurse, and I was absolutely overwhelmed by the degree of suffering I saw in the people in our community. At the first project, of the people who were housed at this first project, 90% of them were injection drug users, 65% had mental illnesses, 85% had some experience with criminal justice, and 50% were HIV, and 80% were undernourished. And they all had the various diseases that have been mentioned earlier by the physician from Geneva. The other crisis that we were experiencing in Vancouver was between 1988 and 1998, 2,413 people died of heroin overdose deaths, which reached a peak in 1998 of 413 preventable overdose deaths in 1 year. So again, a huge part of what we were trying to do is make people understand that drug users were human beings. And this woman, Claire Poirier, created a film. She was from Montreal, and her daughter, who was a heroin addict and a sex trade worker, ended up being brutally murdered by John in Montreal. So all of us, politicians, community members, researchers, healthcare professionals, had to come to these issues as personal ones and understanding that they all have a human face that affect all of us across Canadian society. we flew this woman in to speak in Vancouver during our flight to open the injection site. Let's skip that. By 1998, we had the highest rate of conversion to HIV in the Western world, and this statistic, while it was reported on briefly from a policy perspective, went mostly ignored. The federal government had created something they called the National Action Plan, which made 100 recommendations, one of which was to open an injection site. However, it got ignored, and so 9 months after this report was released federally, we relaunched it. And we held a community event called the Killing Fields, where we had 1,000 crosses planted in a park, and we erected crosses, stopped traffic, and distributed the report as widely as we could. And this event did trigger media attention, which did actually help us move forward.
Live, on the Nous Deborah.
Good afternoon. There's a disturbing new name today for one of Vancouver's most talked about neighborhoods. Community activists are calling the city's downtown east side Vancouver's Killing Fields. They say their area has the highest percentage of people infected with HIV in the Western world.
So it seems funny watching that now, because that really literally was the first recorded news report of that story, and it did pick up a lot of steam as a result of that event. We also wanted to make sure that the people in the community who also were equally divided over the topic of injection sites, it wasn't just that you could walk up to other drug users or even other NGOs that worked with drug users and ask them what they thought. The common consensus on the street at the time was opening a drug use center would be like giving candy to a baby. It would be morally wrong. So we got some money and hosted this conference, which was called Out of Harm's Way. And it was very important from our perspective to sort of level the information playing field and not have a conference like this one where folks on the street couldn't come, but actually have more of what we saw as like a community outreach day, where we literally ended up with 800 people coming to a tent in the freezing rain in the middle of this park. And it was free, and we had food and music, and the whole day we flew folks in from all around. We had a guy named Andrew Bennett from Liverpool came to that. He used to run HIT, and that was a long time ago, but I don't know what he is nowadays. But and it was a pretty exciting day. We had a sort of a local celebrity named Daniel Richler do a walking mic and a roaming mic in the audience. And from our perspective, it really did challenge people, and folks from the community sat there all day taking notes, very earnestly listening, and left feeling quite inspired. And I think it made a massive amount of change.
On November 20th, 1998, hundreds of people participated in Out of Harm's Way, an international symposium on solutions to drugs, crime, and addiction in the inner city.
We did a lot of other things over the next 5 years to turn InSite into a reality. There was political actions, meetings, community processes. However, at the end of the day, I believe that going ahead and actually building a site and then inviting media to come and have a look at it helped turn it into a reality much sooner than somebody if we hadn't taken the lead. What they found was a clean, sanitized area and a safe place. So by 2003, after hundreds of hours of work from hundreds of people, InSite was officially and legally opened. And when InSite opened its doors, it was a very moving day for the families, showing up to say thank you, bringing flowers, and looking at this serene setting with nice music playing and clean surfaces. And people can conceptualize how that radically altered the sense of human kindness being shown to folks, in stark contrast to the others. InSite now has a lot of support across the city of Vancouver, and I believe it was partially because it took such a long time to open. There was a lot of community education that went into the decade previous, and it's been ongoing. So now if you take a poll, the last poll, which was 2007, 76% of folks in the city support it. But having said that, Ottawa is a long way from Vancouver, and there's nowhere near that level of support federally or across our country. There's a lot of things that we have to do still to keep it in the public realm. We have to lock it into debates that are around HIV/AIDS. We have to go to faith-based groups. We have to keep it in the media and work with other groups to continue their endorsements, like the Nurses Union. We have to continue on with our InSite for Community Safety website. We're still collecting letters for the Prime Minister, petitions, faxes into constituency offices, online petitions, all these things that we've had to do ever since the site opened. When it became abundantly clear that Stephen Harper, our Prime Minister, wasn't going to back off in terms of trying to shut it down, he was unalterably unwilling to listen to any of the evidence that had been produced. The PHS, the organisation I represent, took the federal government of Canada, Health Canada, to court, and we filed a court case that went to the BC Supreme Court. And Judge Pitfield ruled, which was kind of groundbreaking, that the decision, he ruled in 2008, but the decision was appealed immediately within 48 hours of us winning the case. We won that decision on constitutional grounds. And once that decision was appealed, it was then heard in the BC Appeal Court. And that BC Court of Appeal ruling was then ruled on in just this past May, and we won that as well. So we've won both of the courts provincially, and so now the federal government has said they're filing an appeal in the Supreme Court of Canada, so that's the next step, and we think that's going to take about a year. And it's exasperating, but it's also kind of exciting, because if it does change drug laws in Canada, it will be pretty astronomical, but it's unfortunate that it has to come through that channel. In terms of evidence, as Marianne's already said, there's tons and tons of evidence there. It all is. Read it all. I've left copies of this thing with everybody on your seats or around the room if you want more. I've got tons of here. And this is, obviously, it's a partnership with researchers, and this has like summaries of most of the relevant papers that have been done, of which there are now over 44 published papers and reports that have cost in excess of $3 million to produce, all of which say InSite has some form of positive contribution to make, none of which is negative. It continues to reach out to a huge population of folks. We've had over 12,000 individuals register at the site since it opened. That's 12,000 individual users. We get around 800 visits a day. And we know that InSite's reduced HIV risk behavior. I can read all these, but basically the summaries are in your the file folder, and it's probably easier if you just have a quick look. But all of the things that InSite said that it was set out to do, it has done. It's reaching the most marginalized. It's reducing the risk of HIV. InSite users are getting regular nursing care. We know that it's increased access to detox. It's saving money, and it's had a positive impact on public order. And we know, for instance, the most conservative cost-benefit analysis that was last done says that InSite saves $6 million, preventing 35 new cases of HIV and 3 deaths per year. And that, again, that sort of weighing up of how many lives are you saving thing. We've got that same debate going on in Vancouver, and I would love it. I don't know if Evan lives at the conference or not. Is he here? Do you know? Dr. Irvin? Is he? So he's probably going to hopefully present his overdose deaths stats, but we finally now do have a research paper indicating how many overdose deaths would have how the decrease of overdose deaths in the area. And I won't steal his punchline, but it's good news. We now have some demonstrable information that we can show on a big chart that says, look, it's preventing death. Whereas before we had to use these modeling exercises that took years to produce any kind of stat. And the last one was, I think we were saving three lives a year, which is crazy because we're doing 20 overdose interventions a month and have been since it's opened. So, of course, we all know there's no silver bullets or magic pills, and that's one of the frustrating frames around the InSite debate. Whatever forum you're in, people always want to throw the stone and say, yeah, but this isn't doing this, and it's not curing cancer, and it's not, bringing world peace, but it is doing what it was intended to do, and we can prove that, and we've got plenty of evidence to prove that it does work. And it is exasperating for us being not in Europe, being isolated over there on the North American continent, where we are seen as nutcases in some ways on the outer edges of the sort of dialogue on this stuff. And so we do need the support from people here who are more enlightened. And in getting your support, we you said, for addicts in Canada, the party's over. And as someone who's met family members at the airport to tell them that their child has died, or as someone who has sat in countless memorial services beside weeping relatives, I don't believe there's ever been a party, and I couldn't tell you one person I thought of as a write-off, or as someone whose life wasn't important enough to appreciate, listen to, understand, or celebrate. But instead, what I see every day is Canadians who've lived in extreme poverty and have been defined by social exclusion. It's been a struggle to open the injection site, and it's involved many, many partners and many champions. So I want to thank you all for being part of this solution, because I'm sure the heroic work you're all doing in this movement has helped considerably in advancing these sorts of policies. I'd also like to ask you for your help. And on the back of this pamphlet there is information about our website, one of which is a letter campaign that you can just click on and add your name to the website. The other is where you can actually send a letter to the Prime Minister. And lastly, if you live in a city where they don't have an injection site, please open one.